Lesson 9.1, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about quadratic equations and square roots. Now, quadratic equations just means an equation that has an x squared in the equation. We'll get into that more in depth in chapter 9, but lesson 9.1 now, or farther in chapter 9, lesson 9.1 right now is just talking about square roots, okay? And eventually we're going to be talking about solving equations with x squareds in them. Now, if you remember in chapter 8, what we did was we had equations that looked like this, 8 squared. Okay, what was the answer to 8 squared? It was 64. And we dealt with exponents. So what chapter 9 is, or at least lesson 9.1, is we are taking the reverse of that. I'm asking you, what is the square root of 64? Okay, this symbol right here is called the radicand. That is the formal name, okay? It's also known as the square root symbol, all right? But it is called, the formal name is called the radicand. So if it ever says solve using a radicand or solve what's underneath the radicand, you know it's talking about the square root symbol. So what a square root is we're looking for a number that can be multiplied exactly with itself to give us what is underneath the radical. So what is the square root of 64? 8, because I know that 8 times 8 equals 64, okay? Now, most all of you are probably familiar with square roots. You've heard of them before. You've done them before. But I just want to re-go over this just in case maybe you don't remember it, okay? Now, what if I said, what's the square root of 6? Are there any two numbers that will multiply exactly together to give you 6? 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 2 is 4, 3 times 3 is 9. So is there any number at all that says square root of 6? No. So what you could do then is you could plug it in your calculator and get a decimal for it, okay, which is what we're going to do in this lesson. We'll learn how to simplify the radical later on in this chapter, but for right now, we're just going to use the decimal, okay? So in our first example, this is the one major thing people mess up on square roots. They're not hard. You can plug them into your calculator to find the answer, but every single square root, unless specified, has two answers. Two answers, okay? Because I know, all right, let's ask ourselves this. What is the square root of 9? You say, okay, that's 3. So 3 times 3 is 9. But what about negative 3? What's negative 3 times negative 3? Positive 9 also. So every single answer has two square roots. We have a positive 3 and negative 3. Because what a square root is I can take this exact number and multiply it with itself again and get the number underneath the radicand. Now, an easier way to write this, you could use the positive and negative symbol and write 3. That tells me that my answer is positive 3 and negative 3. If you want to write it out as two numbers, that's fine. If you want to do it a little bit shorter, you can do this way. Either way is fine. But that is the one thing that you have to remember about these problems, okay? Now, in the definition, it says all real numbers. You say, okay, what do you mean by real numbers? Real numbers are any digit from 0 to infinity that has to be positive. Real numbers are not negative at all, okay? So, when I have a negative number underneath the radical, ask yourself this. Is there any number at all that will multiply with itself, exactly with itself, to give me negative 9? 3 times 3 is positive 9. You say, okay, what about negative 3? Negative 3 times negative 3 is positive 9. So anytime at all you have a negative number underneath the radical, your answer is none or no square root. Either one, okay? There's no such number that will be the square root. Now, no such real number. Once you get into Algebra 2, you're going to deal with these things called imaginary numbers, and that's when you have a square root of a negative number, but I'm going to save that for Algebra 2 and let your teacher explain that to you, okay? So, as far as you're concerned, we're just looking for the square roots of real numbers. That means a positive number. Now, anytime there is a negative sign on the outside of the square root, we just got finished saying, there are two answers to every square root problem. There's a positive and a negative. Sometimes they will have the sign on the outside that tells you, I want to know the negative square root of 9 only. So, what's the negative square root of 9? Negative 3. So my answer, anytime there is a negative sign on the outside, has to be negative. Two totally different things from when it's outside and from when it's underneath. Two totally different things, okay? This one is negative 3. This one is none or no square root. All right? Is everybody familiar with this at least? Okay, so let's do this. Let's find the answer to these. Now, we just basically did these problems, all right? Trevor, what is the square root of 9? Perfect, positive and negative 3. When they do not specify which answer they want, when they don't say, give me the positive square root of 9 or give me the negative, I always want you to assume they want both answers. Okay, Nick, what is the answer to this next problem? Negative 3. Perfect. They told me they want the negative square root of 9. Zoe, what's the answer to the next problem? Exactly. Positive, negative 3. Because right here they specified, I want the positive and the negative. You say, but that's the exact same as the first one. Yep. Because when they don't specify, I want you to give both, just to be sure. And Caleb, what is the answer to this last one? None. There are no square roots to negative 9. No square root. Okay? All right, so now we're going to deal with numbers whenever they do not have an exact square root. Christina, first of all, let's look at this one. Does 36 have an exact square root? 6, exactly. And which of the square roots for 36 do they want? The positive or negative? Negative. So my answer is negative 6. But look at this next one. The square root of 8. Is there an exact square root of 8? 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 4 is 16. So I do not have an exact square root. So what you're going to do is you're going to plug this into your calculator. Most of your calculators will give you this answer right here. Right now, I do not want that answer. Now, eventually, we'll learn how to get that answer and we'll do that. But right now, the instructions say round to the nearest hundredth. So I want your answer in decimal form. So somebody call out to me, what is the decimal you got on your calculator, Zoe? 2.83. 2.8. Give me the whole thing. 2.828. This is the answer you should have gotten. Now it says round to the nearest hundredth, okay? How many decimal places is the hundredth spot? 2. So that means I look to the number behind it and I say it's an 8, so I round up and my answer is 2.83. How many answers does every square root have? 2. So what should this be? Positive and a negative 2.83. Now you have to round up, okay? All right, now let's use the square root symbol in an actual problem where we need to plug numbers in, okay? First of all, before we get started, this formula right here, the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, is called the discriminant. Okay, we will learn more about that in chapter 9.4. But for right now, just remember that this formula is called the discriminant, and we'll actually get into what the discriminant is later on, but we're just going to use it as an actual formula right now, that we can just plug the numbers in. And if you look right here, they've given us A, they've given us B, and they've given us C. So all we want to do is plug it in and solve what I have. So let's plug in here. I have my square root symbol, or the radicand. B squared, so I have negative 2 squared minus 4 times A, which is 1, and C, which is negative 3. Now, again, this problem is not necessarily hard, okay? However, people get it wrong all of the time because they don't pay attention to the positive and the negative signs. Careless errors, okay? When you plug in B, it's negative 2. What is negative 2 squared? Positive 4. If you plug into your calculator negative 2 squared and you don't use parentheses, it is going to tell you the answer is negative 4. And that is wrong, okay? Because negative 2 times negative 2 is positive 4 no matter what, okay? This is where most people make their mistakes, and then they get an answer of no square root or none because they ended up with a negative number when they should have had a positive, and then it messes everything else up. Okay, so we have 4. Now, this sign right here, this is another one that people mess up on. What does that tell me that this 4 is? Tyreek? A negative. Treat this just like a negative 4. Don't treat it like a subtraction problem. So we say, okay, negative 4 times 1 is negative 4. Negative 4 times negative 3 is positive 12. So look what happens there. Just because you start out with a subtraction problem doesn't mean it's always going to be subtraction. If you've got if you've got an even amount of negative signs, it's going to change your answer to an addition problem. Okay? So what's 4 plus 12? Square root of 16, which is positive and negative 4. That would be your answer there. Now, another careless error people make is they do, 4 plus 12 is 16. This is my answer. Nope. What did you forget? The square root symbol. Then I know the square root of 16 is 4. Again, another careless error. People leave the square root sign. No. The square root sign is actually an action. I am doing the square root of 16, just like I were to subtract or to add or whatever. So once you do that, that sign is gone. Once I find the square root of 16, it is just going to be a positive and a negative 4. Okay? All right, I want you guys to do this one on your own. Okay, so this should be your answer to this problem. Moving right along. Now, we are going to solve equations with an x squared in it. Your final answer will never, ever include an x squared. Because I've not got an x by itself. What does that squared mean? How many x's do I have? 2. I cannot find a final answer with 2 x's. So there's a very simple solution. You say, okay, well, how do I get x by itself? Very simple. I take the square root. What that square root does is it cancels out the squared, and I'm left with 1x only. But guess what? If I do that to one side, I've got to do it to the other. So I also take the square root of 4. So now I have an x by itself, and I'm left with, what is the square root of 4? Positive and negative 2. I will always have 2 answers to a square root problem. Okay? Now let's do this next one. I look and I see, okay, I need to get x by itself because it's not by itself, it's x squared. So I do the square root. Cancels out the squared. What I do to one side, I've got to do to the other. Can I simplify the square root of 5? No, there's no number that is exact square root of 5. So guess what I want you to do? Plug it in your calculator and round to the nearest hundredth, which is 2 decimal places. So Caleb, what did you get there? Okay, somebody help him out. Tyreek, what did you get? 2.4. Now, why is there not another number? Because it's rounded to the nearest hundredth.
No, I meant x equals 2.24.
2.24. Very good. 2.24. Okay. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do these. How would I get this x by itself, Zoe? Square root it. Cancels out that. And I do the square root of 0. What is the square root of 0? 0. Do I need a positive negative sign with the 0? No, because is 0 positive or negative? Nope. 0 is always just 0. So there is the one exception to where you will not have two answers. You will just have one. Now, Hebron, what would I do on this next problem to solve it? Square root symbol, which cancels it out. Square root symbol here. What is the square root of negative 1? Nothing. There is nothing that's the square root of negative 1. So x equals no square roots because there is nothing that is the square root of negative 1. Okay? Now these problems here, okay, we're getting a little more in depth. We solve them exactly like you would a regular problem. Okay, so what would I do? Let's just pretend like this was 3x plus 4 or minus 48 equals 0. What would you do first to solve this problem? Keone? Add 48, exactly. I'm not doing anything different than I would with a regular problem. So I add 48 to both sides. And now I have 3x squared, don't forget about that squared, equals 48. Now, this is where people jump the gun. They go, oh, I got to do the square root. No. What is still in front of that x that I need to get rid of, Nick? The 3. And so what do? Divide. I divide by 3 on both sides. And I get x squared is equal to 16. Now, did I find my answer? Do I know that x equals 16? No, because it's x squared. So, Kenneth, what would I do now? Square root. Very good. So I take the square root, which cancels that out. Square root of 16. And I know that x is equal to positive and negative 4. Remember, there should always be two answers. Now, this next one's a little trickier. What should I do first? Subtract 27. Keone, how did you know I was supposed to subtract and not add? Because 27's positive. Do not be fooled by that minus sign right there. It's not 27's, it's 3's. So I subtract 27 on both sides. 0 minus 27 is negative 27. Do not forget about that negative sign. So now I have negative 3x equals negative 27. Kendall, what would I do now? Divide by negative 3. And x squared is equal to 9. Then, Trevor, what would I do? The square root cancels out. And what is x equal to? Positive and negative 3. Remember, do not give me just 3 as your answer. You will only get half credit because that's only half the answer. Okay? Anybody have any questions so far over these? All right, do these on your own. Okay, these would be your answers to those two problems. Okay, that is it for 9.1.